Imagine being dragged through iron doors, the torch-lit corridor echoing with the cries of the condemned. For women imprisoned in medieval Europe, this wasn't a scene from legend. It was the brutal beginning of incarceration. The moment a woman crossed into a medieval prison, known as a jail in England or a geôle in France, her identity was stripped away, often quite literally. One of the first recorded steps in several European prisons was the shaving of her head. This wasn't merely a hygienic measure, it was symbolic. Hair, especially for women in medieval society, was intimately tied to dignity, modesty, and femininity. Removing it was an act of degradation and submission. Next came the shackles. Women, whether guilty or merely accused, were often bound in iron restraints. In 13th century England, records from York and London describe women being held in bilboes, a form of iron leg restraint, or chained directly to prison walls. These prisons weren't built for justice. Most were makeshift extensions of castles, monasteries, or city halls. Cold, damp stone chambers where women were thrown among thieves, debtors, and the condemned. The concept of separate facilities for female inmates was rare before the 15th century. "Let them be confined and abased," wrote the German legal scholar Ulrich Tengler in Der Laienspiegel, 1509, a legal manual widely used across the Holy Roman Empire when describing female punishment. The purpose was not correction, it was humiliation and isolation. These initial steps, shaving, shackling, public exposure, marked more than incarceration. They marked the stripping of personhood, the beginning of a descent not just into confinement, but into systemic, psychological, and physical degradation. For women in the medieval world, prison was not just a place of captivity, it was the first step in being erased. Starvation cells, the forgotten corner of the dungeon. Not all medieval punishments came with whips or racks. Some worked slowly, silently, and were no less brutal. In the shadowed recesses of medieval prisons, often beneath the main dungeon floor, were what chroniclers grimly referred to as hunger chambers. For many imprisoned women, these starvation cells became a death sentence delivered without trial. These were small, windowless enclosures, sometimes no larger than a coffin in height or breadth. Prisoners were confined without light, bedding, or sufficient food. In 14th century France, the oubliette, literally the forgotten place, was a notorious example. Women were lowered into these underground shafts through a trapdoor, often never to be raised again. Some oubliettes were carved directly into castle rock foundations, such as those in Loches Castle or the Bastille. Once the door closed above them, few ever saw daylight again. Officially, starvation was not always a declared punishment, but in practice, denying food became a common tool. Records from medieval English jails suggest that women accused of moral crimes or suspected witchcraft were kept in close ward, without bread or water for days. Conditions in these cells accelerated suffering. Without sanitation, food, or warmth, even the healthiest bodies deteriorated rapidly. Women often lay in their own filth, covered in lice and sores. Death came from dehydration, malnutrition, or slow septic infections. But for some, the psychological torture came first. Many prisoners screamed for days before falling silent, yet their deaths were often undocumented, their names omitted from ledgers, their bodies buried in unmarked ground outside prison walls. The starvation cell was not just a tool of punishment, it was a deliberate erasure, a space where women were neither executed nor freed, merely left to vanish. And in that silence, the system achieved its most chilling effect. It taught other women to fear not only guilt, but accusation. For the women who entered these dark enclosures, punishment wasn't declared. It was simply endured. Forgotten by law and by history, they died unnamed, their suffering absorbed by the cold stone around them. Branded for sin, punishment for immorality, behind bars. In medieval Europe, the concept of crime was deeply entwined with religious and moral codes. For women, the label of sin could lead to brutal punishments, even without evidence of violent crime. Accusations of adultery or other so-called immoral behavior were often enough to bring the full force of civic and ecclesiastical justice down upon them. And once convicted, many of these women bore their sentence for life, permanently marked on their bodies. Branding as corporal punishment was legally sanctioned in parts of Europe, particularly by the late medieval period. In England, branding was used from at least the 13th century for crimes like theft or repeat offenses, and by the 15th century, it extended to women accused of vice crimes. A 1563 statute under Queen Elizabeth I, though slightly later, confirmed the use of branding for vagrants, which often included women labeled as nightwalkers, a term used for suspected prostitutes. They could be branded with a V, permanently marked on their upper body. Earlier references exist as well. Court rolls from 14th century London and York record punishments for women arrested for common misconduct or living without governance. Branding, while less frequently documented than whipping or pillorying, was occasionally mentioned in civic records as a visible mark of disgrace. In Scotland, under the 1424 Act of Parliament, repeat offenders, including women deemed unmannerly or idle, could be subject to marking with iron. Documentation from the Bridewell Palace in London, converted into a prison by King Edward VI in 1553, details how women charged with prostitution were regularly whipped and publicly shamed. Some were also branded, though surviving records do not always specify the exact symbol used. As 15th century jurist Fortescue noted in De Laudibus Legum Angliae, the correction of sin is visible to all, that others may fear and not fall. This reflects the guiding principle of branding, punishment made permanent and public. Branding wasn't universally applied, and its use varied by region and period. But when it was inflicted, especially on women, it carried not only pain, but a permanent erasure of social status. A marked woman could not easily return to ordinary life. Her flesh spoke for her, often louder than any defense ever could. Branding was a tool not just of punishment, but of permanent moral condemnation. For women labeled immoral, it meant living as an open symbol of disgrace, by design. Witch trials behind bars, torture before the verdict. Before any flames were lit or verdicts passed, many women accused of witchcraft in medieval Europe endured long periods of imprisonment and torture. These tortures weren't punishments after conviction. They were tools used during interrogation, often before a formal trial ever began. Under both secular and ecclesiastical systems, the logic was chillingly simple. Truth must be forced from the body. By the late 15th century, witchcraft accusations surged, especially after the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, 1487, a legal and theological manual by Inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. It argued that women, by their nature, were more prone to witchcraft and deception, and endorsed the use of torture to extract confessions. Torture was officially permitted under Roman law and canon law, provided there was sufficient indicia, that is, strong preliminary suspicion. In Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and parts of France, torture devices were routinely used in the questioning of suspected witches. The strappado, one of the most common methods, involved binding a woman's arms behind her back, hoisting her by a rope, and then suddenly dropping her, causing intense strain on the shoulders. Other recorded techniques included thumb screws, which applied severe pressure to the fingers, and the boot, which compressed the legs using wedges until serious injuries occurred. The rack, used primarily in England and the Low Countries, stretched the body to the point of joint damage, often resulting in lasting harm. These methods were applied while the accused was still legally presumed innocent. What makes these acts more horrifying is that confessions under torture were not just extracted, they were expected. And often, these women were forced to name others, fueling further arrests. In some German towns, this led to entire female communities being wiped out. In Würzburg, 1626 to 1631, though slightly post-medieval, over 150 women were executed following confessions extracted under torture. In medieval witch trials, the prison cell became a chamber of prejudgment. Torture wasn't a sentence. It was a method for shaping the story the authorities wanted to hear, long before any verdict was pronounced. Medieval prisons laid bare how fear and doctrine can weaponize law, turning justice into ritual humiliation and slow death. These cruelties toward women reshaped legal codes and reinforced patriarchal power, echoing today whenever authority is used to police morality. How do you think the treatment of women in these prisons reflected the values and fears of medieval society? Comment below.